With the Historical Society, and I'm glad that you're with us this evening, both in person and on Zoom. Before we proceed with tonight's program, I'd like to remind you that this Friday, February 14th, is the registration deadline for our Dragon's Den tour. Next Sunday, February 23rd. Dragon's Den is in Homestead on the former St. Mary Magdalene Church, and it's now a children's interactive learning center that the director, Julia Laza Petrucci, has transformed. So it should be a great experience for us. And again, I encourage you to register. There are registration forms like this in the back of the room. So after the program tonight, feel free to sign up. It's $10 per person admission. And getting on with tonight's program, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Matthew Johnson-Roberson, the director of the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And before proceeding, I'd like to thank Dr. Philip Lehman, who's in the back there. He is the Associate Dean for Strategic Initiatives in the School of Computer Science, and because of Philip, we were able to secure Dr. Johnson-Roberson's participation tonight. So thank you again, Philip. Dr. Johnson-Roberson previously directed the University of Michigan's Ford Center for Autonomous Vehicles before coming here, and he's had a distinguished career in academia. He's the recipient of the National Science Foundation's NSF CAREER Award, and he earned his bachelor's degree at CMU and a Ph.D. from the University of Sydney in Australia. So at this time, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Matthew Johnson-Roberson.
Thank you all so much. So I was going to talk tonight about a bit of the history of robotics as it relates to CMU and Pittsburgh, and then kind of talk about some of the cycles and patterns that we see and where things may be going. So I call this Emerging Past. So this is the shared history of sort of not just robotics, but also AI and how those two fields are interrelated, and really how they've been very interrelated here at Carnegie Mellon for quite a long time. So I wanted to start with sort of painting a picture of where we are from the perspective of success. So that means that many things in robotics work now, which wasn't true for a long time. And so as a benefit of that, there's lots of things you can see out there in the world that robots are doing, which we think are cool and important. So probably the most easy one to identify in my mind is where we are with self-driving cars, and that's sort of my area of research for a long time, and so it's, I guess, really heartening to see that there's sort of this long arc of history, and we'll talk about sort of where a lot of that came from, but that we've gotten to this point where you can now, in a number of cities in the US, get into a self-driving car and travel between two different locations with no driver in the front, which really wasn't even possible a couple of years ago. So we've come a long way. So this is Waymo. That's one of the vehicles in San Francisco, one of the companies still operating there. And through a lot of the promotional material, they have been talking about having these vehicles driverless for a long time, but really that is a practical reality. If you go to San Francisco now, you can get into a Waymo and go between two locations within the city bounds pretty reliably at this point, which again was not possible even just a couple years ago. So this is Cruise. They were operating, they have sort of ramped down their operations after a number of sort of missteps and accidents, but they also were operating for a number of years, day and night, driverless vehicles. Yeah. I think there's going to be sound on that one, which you may need to turn off, otherwise it's going to play a lot of noise. No, you'll be all good, but it's it'll blast you in a second. This is a vehicle that I designed and built along with a team. So this is when I was based in Ann Arbor. We built smaller vehicles that were designed for last mile food delivery. And so the idea is that we're trying to see robots more and more, hopefully in our daily lives. And this is a video that hopefully won't have sound online. Excellent. So, we think about robots in a lot of different ways, but one of the things to think about is people think a lot about legged robots or humanoids, but I think you need to kind of broaden the way you think about robots in that drones, self-driving cars, all of those kind of devices really all use a lot of the same technology, which we think is good and hopefully important. Do you guys want me to slow down so the Zoom people can catch up? Yeah, no, yeah. You tell me. Please, question.
Not a question, but relatively recently, I was in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And we actually wanted to get a Waymo, but they were all busy. But we were driving behind one, and it just smoothly goes in and out of traffic. It's really amazing to see.
It's come a long way, and we'll kind of talk about it tonight, but that really was not possible even 5 years ago. They were pretty far back. So you can see sort of, and the sort of, anyways, we'll get into the long history of it, but yeah, they work way better now. So let's talk about the early days, particularly of AI. So I am lucky enough to work in Newell Simon Hall, which is right there, just down the road. And so that is named for these two gentlemen, Newell and Simon, and they really are seen in many ways as kind of the progenitors of what we now call modern AI. And so, if talking about the beginning of it, there's a Herb Simon quote that I like from 1957, in which he says, "It is not my aim to surprise or shock you, but the simplest way I can summarize is to say that there are now in the world machines that think, that learn, and that create. Moreover, their ability to do these things is going to increase rapidly until, in a visible future, the range of problems that they can handle will be coextensive with the range to which the human mind has been applied." So, even as far back as that, people were realizing that this could be possible. I think one of the challenges is that our sort of reach exceeded our grasp for quite a while in terms of what we're able to actually do, particularly in robotics, and we'll talk about sort of why that is. But I think it's important to realize that there are people sort of thinking and probably more importantly dreaming about what it would mean to have programs that could think out there in the world or do things that we think of as part of human intelligence as far back as the 1950s. So this is a sort of Newell quote, right? And he's talking about sort of this idea of what brought him this sense of purpose, particularly around thinking about why he wanted to dedicate much of his career to AI. And so his quote about working on this sort of field was, "I had such and such a clarity that this was a new path and one that I was going down and completely absorbed in," right? So you can think about these two people that dedicated much of their professional working lives to trying to push this field forward, even in an era in which we didn't really have the computing power or the technology to make manifest a lot of the things that they wanted to do. But being able to think abstractly about those problems and think about what could exist, I think is one of the things that's really special about universities. And we're in a very turbulent time for higher ed right now. It's always like to stress that there's this really important function that places that are dedicated to human thought serve, even if it's not clear what the immediate year-over-year economic impact is. The idea that, in the 1950s we could think about these problems that could then be used almost 70 or 80 years later, I think is one of the things that I like to think about when we think about the through line of everything we're doing here. So another quote is that people only change course when they're ready to, and so once he started down this artificial intelligence cognitive processing path, I haven't changed since. And so again, it's I think about finding this sense of discovery or wonder, in particularly robotics and AI, that I kind of try to communicate to people as to why it captures so many people's imagination and they want to study and work on it. Okay, so Newell defined these attributes of intelligence, and so they're actually pretty easy to understand even from just the outside, but learn from experience, right? That should be kind of intuitive. Acquire and use large amounts of knowledge, operate in real time, tolerate error and ambiguity, collaborate and communicate using language, and use symbols and abstraction, and he called it chunking. But those ideas, if you think about things like ChatGPT or even what we're seeing in sort of these new agent sort of style AIs that are talking to each other and working to kind of solve problems collectively, they really do capture many of these things. And so whether or not we think that they are truly intelligent or what the gap is between what we're doing and human intelligence, I think thinking about it in these ways and how this is then effective in solving problems is really useful. So the first artificial intelligence program was a program that was designed to solve for mathematical proofs in Newton's sort of original works. Oh no, what did I hit? And the idea was that there were a couple of concepts that came out of this that ended up being really important. The first of which being that they thought about reasoning as a search problem, which really has actually dictated a lot of what we've done in computer science subsequently. They developed a language, which is the precursor to Lisp, which is one of the programming languages that sort of helped kick off the boom in artificial intelligence in the late 60s. And then thinking about heuristics that allowed them to solve these problems with the computing power they had then. So another important figure to kind of talk about the early days of artificial intelligence is John McCarthy. And so he wrote Lisp, which was this programming language that really did open up the idea or the ability for us to think about programs that could be intelligent or capture some amount of knowledge. And so, the idea that McCarthy wrote about was this idea that we would be able to develop programs that could learn from their experiences. And Lisp was an interpreted language for the programming language heads in the room. Many of the languages we use now, like Python, those are interpreted languages. Things like C, C++, Java, those are compiled languages. And so at this time, it was actually very expensive to not use a compiled language or use something like assembly. And so again, Lisp, in many ways, required new hardware and all of these things. But I'll kind of talk about parallels here to what we're seeing today. So what most people sort of consider the birth of the sort of modern version of AI was at this Dartmouth retreat in 1956. Both all of these folks and then a few others that aren't pictured here. But this is really where people came together and said, let's start thinking about what artificial intelligence could mean moving forward.
Are there any females at all? This is
a great question. So I will circle back to talk about some of the women that were really important at CMU later in the history, but you will notice a certain monochromacity and a lack of gender diversity in the early days of AI, which is very topical even today. So, We'll try to. I'm going to hopefully feature the ones that we were able to pull out of the history books. So quite deliberately, we did a lot of our work in the early days on these toy tasks. So these toy tasks basically were saying that they didn't have much special knowledge, right? And that was really a limitation of where programs were at the time. We had very small hard drives, very small amounts of RAM, all of those kind of things, and so. The idea is we did figure out ways of solving these problems that didn't require access to a lot of information. And that's probably the radical shift to where AI is today and where we were back then. We have the benefit of having access to so much more information. And if you ask me, what has fundamentally changed in AI, very little of the underlying concepts that were kind of developed in this era have changed. But one of the things that has changed is that we just have access to far more data. And that'll sort of be the kind of persistent theme throughout everything we talk about. So probably the most important single development in the history of this field was the perceptron. So Rosenblatt developed the perceptron. This is a photo of him from Cornell, his days in Cornell. The perceptron was an idea introduced in 1958 with the concept of trying to model what the human neuron does. Now this is where things get a little I would say unclear. So we know a fair bit more now about how neurons work and how the brain works, and probably the way an artificial neural net, which is what we're going to talk about here, and the brain work are pretty different. But that being said, this concept was useful enough to be able to kind of power everything we do now in AI, all of deep learning, all of large language models, all the stuff that you see today from this fairly simple concept. Very tragically, he died in a boating accident, and so never really got to see the utility of the perceptron. So it's a good example of developing things that you never get to see come to fruition, but have importance for later generations. But yeah, he died at 43, very, very tragically. And they actually have named, the IEEE named an award after him, and it's still given out today to people that are doing interesting and important work. Okay, so the lesson I think I want to leave you with on all of that is that ending fields of inquiry prematurely is bad, in the sense that they developed the perceptron without any real sense of how it was going to be used, without the computing power to actually do anything with it. And despite all that, it ended up powering everything we do today in deep learning. And so, had we abandoned that or really not figured out a way of learning from that or keeping that around so people could go dig up that paper in libraries, I think we would be in a really tough spot today. The second one is like the impact of hype. So I'm going to try to talk about how that impacts everything we're doing today and everything that happened before. And then the final lesson I want to kind of leave you with is that timing ends up being really important. So I promised to talk about robots. We haven't talked about robots yet, so let me get into talk to some robots. So this is the Unimate. So this was developed in 1959, and this is really the first robot arm that would have any relevance to robot arms today. So this is a video from 1967 of the Unimate doing these tasks that this is it pouring drinks. So it's alcohol, one of the consistent through lines in human history. So this is it supposedly making a drink that appears to be rice, though. But the idea was that you'd have a robot bartender making you drinks. But you can see that this, even for this time, right, is not dissimilar to what would come into play when we think about, production line automation and all those kind of things. So this is work from very recently. So this is David Held, one of our faculty members who works just down here in Newell Simon Hall. And you can see that even today, he is still working on that same problem of how do I pour a drink. And so I think that kind of highlights to me that there's this disconnection between being able to show something once, like that video we saw from the 1960s, and being able to do it in a way that's reliable enough or works well enough to actually be useful. And so we are still working on that problem today, 50, 60 years later, and we still haven't solved it. And so I do think it's important to keep in mind that you can see a video of like, oh, I saw a robot that once, but we still have a long way to go on a lot of these problems. So this is learning how to pour a drink with a robot as of a couple of years ago. Probably the next robot that ends up being super, super important is the Stanford arm. That's from 1969. And so, what were the lessons we took away from that? It showed what a light robot arm can do. That moved away from this giant arm that was really expensive and heavy, and to a lighter robot arm that gets us into sort of more of this mobile domain, where the robot arm could at some point move around, or at least be light enough or less dangerous enough that you didn't need these hydraulics and this very complicated system. And that sort of really leads into what we'll see now with humanoids and all the kind of robot arms that we're using today. So I work on mobile robots, which I think are more interesting than stationary robots. And so a lot of the dream of mobile robots and what you saw in Waymo and all of that, I think came out of this idea that, there are these tasks that we do as humans that are really, really simple, but we have this dream that we're going to be able to play dominoes in our car and not have to drive, and we're still not there. Waymo's almost there, but I assume all of you have cars that don't drive themselves, so we're not completely there yet. So probably the earliest mobile robot is this one from William Walter, and it was a biologically inspired robot that was designed to kind of act like an insect. So you'll see it's going to respond to light here, and then basically react to that stimuli, and then move differently based on that. And so this was sort of one of the really early examples of where mobile robotics was going, but it was a robot that could move around, sense its environment, and then make decisions. And that's really the core of everything we're trying to do. The next one was the Hopkins Beast. That's probably the next most important robot. It's from 1961. This is a mobile robot base that's starting to look more like robots that we have today. But this robot has a very special feature, which is it could drive around, and when it ran out of batteries, plug itself back in to recharge. So many of you who have a mobile robot vacuum that can charge itself by returning to its base owe a lot to the Hopkins Beast, which was one of the first robots attempting to figure out how to solve that problem. Oh no!
Oh, we go backwards.
Zoom ahead. So there's the robot figuring out where the outlet is, plugging itself into a 110 wall outlet, which I'm sure is wildly unsafe. They'd never let us in today for occupational health and safety reasons. But a lot of these ideas, again, persisted. Probably the next robot that's worthwhile talking about, in my opinion, is Shaky, which is a robot out at Stanford. So this is the robot that starts to get into what we would see today. So this is a robot that has cameras on it and a mobile base, and it's taking pictures and then moving around. Now the challenge is that computing was so slow in the 1970s that it could take a picture and then think for 3 or 4 minutes and then make a decision and then take another picture and think for 3 or 4 minutes and make another decision. So this is an incredibly sped up version of what it was actually doing. They call it shaky because it shook around a lot as it was moving. But you can see that this is sort of getting at what we're hoping to do now, right? Which is to move through an environment, understand it, and make decisions. You can see it's running into that box. I'm not sure whether it's supposed to run into that box or not, but it is pushing that box. So this was, operator would type a command, push a block off the platform with the computer console. Shaky would look around, identify a platform with a block on it, locate a ramp, and push the ramp over to the platform, roll up the ramp, and push the block off the platform. Mission accomplished. This is a paper from 2023 where we're doing the exact same thing. Still, we have a goal to stack the red object on top of the blue object. Now we use probably a couple 100,000 times more computing power, but are trying to solve that exact same problem that we were trying to solve back then. So a lot of these things stick around. So, in talking about shaky, right, we worked for months trying to find a good name for it, ranging from Greek names to whatnot. And then one of us said, hey, it shakes like hell and moves around, let's just call it shaky. So I think there's a good lesson as to how to name your robots. Then in the 1960s, Raj, who is the founder of the Robotics Institute and a number of other things at CMU, started the DARPA Speech Understanding Research Project, so SIR. And that was a $15 million project over 5 years. And the goal was to figure out how computers could understand verbal commands and then hand off for interactions with equipment in combat situations. Now, why I bring this project up is that, again, this was probably one of the first examples of a large government-funded project that was designed to solve this problem that was really pretty far off, right? So this was in probably 2 or 3 decades before we'd actually get to things like Siri or voice assistants that actually work reliably. But again, I think thinking about these big and long problems ends up being really, really important. So this is Hans Moravec. I'm gonna go the wrong way. He was at CMU and a number of other places, but one of the reasons why he wrote a really interesting book that I would highly recommend. It's a good read. I can't remember the name of it, but I think it's the only book he wrote. He talks very, very honestly about a lot of the challenges that we faced from a funding perspective and other things in robotics at the time. So there were funding comebacks in 1974. Some of the people were going to be taught a lesson, so DARPA was really mad. They were grumpy about a number of things, totally unclear. And people were having their $2 million a year contracts cut to almost nothing. And they really wanted to stick it to Stanford, MIT, and Carnegie Mellon and send us a message. But what was super interesting is that those projects were sort of derailed at that point in time, and that probably set back speech recognition by at least a decade from where it would have been had that funding persisted. So the Dragon Project developed CMU's SIR project, the predecessor of Harpy, pioneered the use of techniques borrowed from mathematics, including things like hidden Markov models, and the market for speech recognition systems would reach $4 billion by 2001, so that was sort of a prediction, and then we've seen speech become this really, really dominant form of communication now, obviously. That's the book. I forgot, I did remember the book, Mere Machine to Transcendent Mind. But he talked a lot about sort of the philosophy around what we needed to learn in robotics to make artificial intelligence work. So here's another good example of robots from that era. This is a Stanford cart. It would take photos, process them, and then move really, really slowly. So you can see it's taking photos with the flash there, and then moving a couple inches. And this is really where we were in the state of modern robotics in the late 1970s, early 1980s. You could do things, but you could do them very, very slowly. Okay, so we're going to have to accelerate if I'm going to get through all of robotics history by the time we got to get out. So we're going to go through the 80s and 90s pretty quickly. So what was happening in AI in the 80s and 90s? If anybody was working in the field back then, you may remember the fury around expert systems. So this is an expert system to determine what type of sea animal you're looking at, whether it's a whale or a dolphin or a baby whale or shark or swordfish or other things. But this became quite the rage, and so you would see these architectures that got generated and all of this interest. And so in the 1980s, John McDermott, who was at CMU, handed his first working version of this XCON expert systems to DEC at the time. And then by 1984, XCON had grown tenfold. By 1986, the company invested 50 person years in the program, and they were saving somewhere in the order of $40 million a year in 1980s dollars. By 1985, 150 companies had spent $1 billion altogether on internal AI groups, again in 1980s dollars. And then the DEC AI group had grown to 77 people by 86 and 700 by 88. And so the reason I mention this is that these patterns that begin to emerge if you look at the history of AI over time. And there's a very clear pattern that emerges, which is that people get really, really excited about a thing. A ton of money flows in, things get really frothy, and then lots of things change, not always for the better. So by 87, there were 100 expert systems in operation and 500 various stages of development at DuPont. And by 86, AI hardware, right, was reaching sales of $425 million. 40 companies have been formed with a total investment of $300 million, which was a lot in this area that was very, very small. So one of the lessons again here is that bubbles seem to always pop. So with the expert systems bubble, right, the private sector demand for personnel competent in artificial intelligence far exceeded the supply. This should all sound super familiar if you're following what's happening with AI today. The shortage propelled salaries to sky-high levels and created pressure for researchers to leave academia for private industry. So I got a ton of that going on right now in robotics. I got a ton of people on leave. So that's all interesting and seems relevant. And then fewer bright students were willing to endure miserly stipends of graduate school when industry salaries started them off as much as $30,000 a windfall in 1980. So, starting salaries for AI researchers at, whatever, take your large tech companies are sort of in the $500 to $1 million a year, and our stipends are, I think, quite good and quite competitive, but they're nowhere near as large as that. Yep, I can definitely tell you. One of the lessons I think that's important is that these kind of bubbles can hollow out in academic fields. So you saw this huge exodus of people from that research into these companies, and it really changed the dynamics. So there was a massive crash as a result of poor business decisions by the academic founders of the first AI companies, blinded as they were by their unquestioning faith in specialized Lisp language. Thousands of people lost their jobs. The Lisp machine company in Andover, Massachusetts filed for bankruptcy, and basically this entire industry of Lisp machines and everybody that was working in expert systems, a lot of that went away. So another lesson, which I think is important, is that academics may not always be great business people. And if you listen to lots of the things that are happening, there's a ton of academic founders of AI companies. I wish them all the greatest success in the world, but I hope they also try to avoid the missteps of the past. Okay, I'm going to keep speeding up here. So this is Rod Brooks, another important figure in artificial intelligence. And he's made this point over and over again, but he said that really we aren't getting better very fast. That we keep thinking we are, but it's not really working. So are we learning from our mistakes, I think is the real question to ask. And in robotics, Hans Moravec pointed out this thing that I think is still really, really true, and I want to stress because large language models and other things are working really well now, but robots are still really hard. So it's comparably easy to make computers exhibit adult-level performance on intelligence tests or playing checkers, and it is difficult or impossible to give them the skills of a one-year-old when it comes to perception and mobility. Now this is less true now, but if you think about the sophistication that large language models display, and you think about what a one-year-old can do with, let's say, a water bottle, we are still in the sort of sounding the one-year-old zone as opposed to where we are with language. And so that's sort of this paradox that he brings up all the time, that it's really hard to do things that are very easy for us physically, and we can do things that are much, much harder, like chess or other things that I would not be good at, and the computer can be the best person in the world. So Takeo Kanade is another important figure from down CMU way. He worked a lot on computer vision in an era where computer vision was sort of in its very, very early days. I got some women for you. One shout out, Jessica Hodgins. So she actually just lives down the way as well, and was a really, really important figure in late at robotics. Still faculty at CMU today, has done a lot of really interesting, important things. So this is one of Jessica's projects when she was still at MIT, but this is sort of the birth of walking robots. And so bipedal robots were really, really hard to make for a bunch of reasons. It's pretty easy for them. For humans, and it's very hard for robots, but we had quadrupeds and bipeds that were really taking off in this era. And those have advanced significantly, and now you can go buy, I have a $4,000 robot that you can buy that is able to walk upstairs and walk around in a pretty agile way, in a way that just really wasn't possible back in the day. Okay, outdoor vehicles. So this is Chuck Thorpe, another former director of the Robotics Institute at CMU in 1985. And so this is over in Shenley Park. This is Terragators. This is from '83. You can see the speed at which our robots operated back in the day. But this was really hard, so it was moving around very slowly, trying to figure out what was happening. And it's on Flagstaff Hill, driving around with 6 wheels, moving very slowly. We did things even larger scale. So this is my boss, the Dean of the School of Computer Science, Marshall. And he here is working with Alan Alda, talking to Alan Alda in an interview for a show, while they're showing how this robot right here, with a very early laser rangefinder on the roof and a bunch of cameras, is finding its way through a field. But again, I think the thing to stress here is that the computing power is very slow, and so these vehicles moved quite slowly, and that was one of the big limiting factors in sort of where we need to go there. So ARPA's 10-year goal for the ALV project was to achieve 80 kilometers per hour on roads and travel long distances across open terrain. The Stanford car took 15 minutes to map obstacles, plan a path, and move each meter. That was Raj's comment on what the goals of that project were, why we were trying to move forward and what we were doing. That's the ALV. This is all from a really great article in Scientific American, Popular Science from October '84, if you ever want to dig it up at the library. So they have a whole breakdown of that whole robot system. You can see that we used to allow for tobacco ads. It got to the next page in that same magazine, so things have changed. But this is the ALV project. So it had a laser there. That line is actually fake. They put that in for the magazine, but you can't actually see the laser that it sent out. But it was able to drive around, and this is, again, really one of the precursors to what you'd see with Waymo and all of that. This is the actual documents that we found describing all of that project and everything it was capable of doing. You can see all the schematic drawings and how all this was planned out and how it was intended to work. They had a very aggressive timeline by 1993 that these robots would be driving around everywhere. We would have completely unmanned vehicles off-road. We are still working on that problem today, so 93 was very ambitious. But Hans, again, in his brutal honesty in that book, he said, I was a co-principal investigator of one of the big multi-million-dollar a year ALV grants. My role in it was basically to drop out. I didn't believe in the project. I didn't think it was possible. My intuition was right. It was really premature. He's one of the few researchers who speaks very frankly about his time in robotics, which I think is very useful. Many researchers were caught up in a web of increasing exaggeration. Their initial promises to DARPA had been too optimistic. Of course, what they delivered stopped considerably short of that, but they felt that they couldn't, in their next proposal, promise less. So I think this is another important lesson for us as academics. We keep promising more and more, and this is the same thing we see for companies, that the next version of whatever the thing is they put out has to be better and better. And I think one of the challenges there is that it leads to sort of that increasing exaggeration. So I think that's one of the things we have to try to reckon with in robotics and AI. These are some of things we got from Takeo that detail everything that they were planning out. But this kept moving forward to the NavLab project. That's the NavLab project in '86, and then here's a NavLab project driving around a suburb in Pittsburgh. That's Chuck Thorpe's son, who I'm sure is a full-grown adult now. They also won't let you do this anymore. Just one for the history books. But this was exhibiting lidar-based optical avoidance and a bunch of things there. And then I like to go back to where we finally got in 1995. This is Dean Pomelo, who did Hands Off Across America. So Hands Off Across America was from Pittsburgh to California, and they did the vast majority of it with no human intervention. Anywho, they worked on a bunch of neural nets and other things to make all that work. I'm going to skip ahead, so the Zoom crowd, I'm going to skip a few of these. Let me shut up. We'll get to the 2000s really quickly because we're running out of time. So this is Ralph, who's still faculty down, again, annual Simon hanging out with us. This is the Ball Bot. So Ralph did a lot of really important and interesting work trying to develop these platforms, these omnidirectional platforms that could move on these balls in any direction. But in thinking about when we're thinking about robotics, part of it is thinking about how do we make the robots more intelligent, and then part of it is also thinking about how do we build more intelligently designed robots that make the problems a lot easier. So Ballbot's a great example of how the control problems and a lot of the navigation problems become easier if you don't have legs, or even in this case wheels, multiple wheels. So a good example there. So there was another big hollowing out of sort of artificial intelligence in 2005, where at its low point, some computer scientists, software engineers avoided the term artificial intelligence. When I came into the field, we never used the term AI. We definitely never used the term neural nets because those were all pretty bad and not seen as good. And so I guess another important lesson is that these things come in waves. Now, everybody says AI in our field, which seems really weird to me because most of the people that are saying it were around when I was around and we couldn't use those terms because everybody thought they were AI. So anyhow. So one of the other things I want to point out, again, John McCarthy, who's one of the important figures, said the amount of journalistic interest and investor interest has fluctuated wildly. AI continued all along thanks to the interest among researchers. So if and when this next bubble pops, when everyone's really excited about large language models and all the things that are happening, my hope is that there will still be a Carnegie Mellon down the road. There will still be researchers that are caring about trying to figure out what the next 30 or 40 years are going to look like. So Raj said in 2005, anytime you can create technology that has the potential of saving 20 or 30,000 lives in a year, one has to sit up and take notice. So I do think that we're still working on really important problems in robotics. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a few more just to get us. Okay, I'm going to do a real quick bit if you have a picture of me. So I'm going to introduce me very quickly. How do I fit into this picture? So that's a young me. It's a young me. This is an old me. I was young and happy. Now I'm old and sad. But I got to work on a really cool project. So when I came to CMU, I got to work on the DARPA Grand Challenge, which is a desert race from LA to Vegas. Red Whitaker was obviously the team lead and one of my early mentors. And so we got to work on a bunch of these really fun, exciting robots. That's a young me down in Hazelwood Green, where we are now building a new building. It was, at that time, the area we were in was the slag heap area of where the steel mill used to be. So this is, again, illegal now in occupational health and safety domains, but that's me working the emergency stop for this giant Hummer. So you'll see it take off in a second, and then I will chase after it and keep my hand out to try to stop it. We definitely don't do this anymore. This is not an essential way of keeping robots safe any longer. Let's see, it's going to take off soon. You can also see the computing box was built out of wood. It was, it was leaner times around CMU back then. Let's see. I think it's going to shoot off, and then I'm going to have to run after it.
What year is this?
This would be probably 2003, I want to say. That's me running after it. That's where Mill 19 is now, one of our buildings down there. But you can see this is the robot's view. And so we were really focused on driving it at very high speeds off-road. Red eventually got to win, which was great. So they finally won the off-road challenge. The robot I built flipped over. So yeah, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. That's the one that won. Okay, so we don't have time to cover the 2000s. So if you want to learn about the 2000s robotics, just read that book, Probabilistic Robotics. It's a great book. It'll teach you everything you need to know about the 2000s. Neural nets is the other thing that like happens in the 2000s. We're going to skip over that and get you up to today. Deep learning, that book has everything else you need to know about whatever happened between late 90s and now. Okay, so how did we get Waymo, or where did that come from? So back in the 1960s, we had the RCA project, which was a car that drove using metal cables in the road. That led to ALV, which is that project we talked about that Raj and others and Hans and a bunch of people were involved with. We then had NavLab, which got hands off across America to go to California, then the DARPA Grand Challenges, and then finally the Urban Challenge. And then we see this transition into industry, right? So that field spawned these companies or these projects inside these massive companies like Google, where we saw the commercialization of a lot of that technology that had been developed since the 1950s. And so, there was a lot of discussion of what was going to happen and how well this was going. And I think one of the challenges that I kind of want to put to this group is it's always hard to know what's actually happening. So these are articles from like 2017 and 2018. This is a 2018 article, and you can see that like they say, oh, everything's working great, and then actually it's not working great. It's world's first self-driving taxi in Singapore, 2016. Waymo puts fully self-driving cars out there. They return their safety drivers. That's in 2018. Self-driving car companies are all sad. That's 2019. Driverless hype collides with merciless reality. $1 billion autonomous vehicle lost its way. 2018 hard reality check. There's a lot of headlines. Workforce cutoffs, shutdowns, all of that. Cruise is going to enter a large number of markets. 2023. And then this is a bunch of cruise vehicles stuck in San Francisco, all honking at each other, blocking traffic. So fits and starts, I guess, is this thing I want to stress. But I guess the context I want to provide is that it really is this long 40-year effort to get to the point where these things are even close to commercialization. And continue to invest in basic research. This is one of my larger messages. I'll skip all this. So lessons, bubbles pop. There were a lot of bubbles that happened when we were self-driving, but I think we are going to see that technology continue to thrive at some point. Timing is everything. Okay, so to use self-driving cars is sort of the last thought to leave you with. This was the Gartner Hype Cycle in 2015. They put self-driving cars, so the Gartner Hype Cycle start from innovation trigger to inflated expectations to trough of disillusionment to slope of enlightenment to plateau of productivity. And so they talk about where technology is. So they said self-driving cars out there on the slope of enlightenment. We're almost there. This was in 2015. Okay, and then what happened in 2017? Well, it moved backwards, which seems bad. So that's cool. In 2018, it's going the right way now. So the gradient's moving in the correct direction. 2019, it's moving a little bit down, but it's moved pretty far back from where they said in 2015. 2021, they just took it off. They're just like, they had no more predictions about it, I guess. And so a lot of this is talking about cycles, right? So I think that one of the things I want to stress is that all the things you're reading about, all of the really cool things that are happening with large language models and other stuff like that, I think is going to be really important and really good. But a lot of the challenges we face is that oftentimes expectations about that technology gets really overly inflated. Investment dollars flow in, and then when things don't work as well as everyone had hoped, everybody floods back out, and we're sort of left with the wreckage of that. And so my hope is that we're going to try to stabilize the way we do these things, at least in robotics and AI, where we don't have these kind of really violent up and down cycles, because I think it's very difficult and takes a long time to recover from each trough. Yes? So then the question is generative AI the next cycle? I don't have the answer to that if that's what you're looking for. I don't know, Bloomberg or some smarter person than me that has a lot more money than me probably has the good answer to what's going to happen with all this new technology. But the thing I can say is that it seems to be following a very similar trend to the last 4 cycles that we saw, which is that there are some significant breakthroughs in what we're seeing. Things are working far better than they have ever previously, but that we probably have overpromised in what they're going to be capable of doing, at least in the short to medium term. And so when everything isn't working exactly as well as had been hoped, I think we're just going to need a longer time to figure out where the right set point is for things like generative AI. And the same is going to be true for robotics. Yes, so let me stop there and I'll take any questions you might have. Questions? Sorry, generative AI is just the term that captures all of the sort of more recent developments in artificial intelligence. They call it generative because it's like things like large language models, so ChatGPT would be a generative AI approach. But it is the class of these sort of big foundational models that can do things like have conversations, interpret pictures, possibly control a robot. We've yet to see if that actually works, but those kind of things. Yeah.
Yes, if federal funding for basic research in AI and robotics is curtailed, what other sources do you foresee filling the gap?
Well, it's going to be industry. That's probably if you look at sort of our funding history at CMU, the big change has been as sort of federal funding has remained flat or even decreased in the sort of face of inflation. Industry is sort of the thing that makes up that gap. Foundations play a role as well, but primarily it's industry, and that has pluses and minuses. I would have said a couple of years ago that industry funding is more unstable than federal funding because the federal government's going to be around and they're going to be doing their thing. We're in a different world now, so I don't know. Federal funding is more uncertain now than we had seen before. But industry is probably a big thing. And there's good and bad parts of that. But probably the biggest change that I've seen in my professional career is there are much larger internal research labs at these large companies now. And so much of the research that used to be done in academia is being done on the industrial side, which is good because they have a lot of money. It's a little bad in that you have to believe that their interest and society's interest are well aligned, which may or may not always be the case. And then the last thing is that a lot of that stuff doesn't make its way into the sort of public domain of knowledge as quickly or ever in some cases. And that makes it hard to build off of. So those are sort of the challenges there, in my opinion.
So where are they going to get their researchers?
They're going to pluck them out of, you mean 10 years from now?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a great question.
If you destroy the university research,
Yes.
where are they going to get them?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I would hope that the people that are siphoning people out of the university have thought about that, but it doesn't seem like that has come up a ton.
But anyhow, the
Please.
question I wanted to ask was, what more does Waymo have to do?
So the big challenge left in self-driving is scaling. So if you think about what Waymo has now is they have a very expensive system that can get you between two places in San Francisco. But right now it costs probably significantly more if you add in all of the true costs of the R&D and everything else that make it amortized out over time or not, than a human driver. And so what they need to do is to get that price down below what it would be to do it with a human. And then the second thing they probably really need to do is figure out how they would move from doing it all in a few cities with really good weather or pretty good weather and not a ton of sort of other challenges to get to the point where you could actually be in, let's say, 30 or 40 American cities or around the world. In terms of safety and other things, they're pretty good. They're probably now getting pretty close to human level safety. I have a whole nother talk about self-driving, but like the bell curve of driver safety is most people are pretty safe, but then at the sort of extremes, you have people that never have accidents and people have a lot of accidents. And so the statistics about human fatalities and other things in driving are really driven by the sort of long tail of that distribution. So anyways, we're probably at a place where if you were to replace all cars on the road with Waymos now, you would generally be safer than we are today, but that's a 30 or 40 year proposition. So, yes.
So I was recently in San Francisco visiting my daughter and her family, and she called her car ride service, and the driverless vehicle came. Why did that happen? Why did it happen there and it can't happen here?
Oh, it's not that there's any, California is slightly different just in sort of the weather distribution. So like they don't do very well with rain or snow or fog. So we have, a little bit more of that. But the real challenge is just that it's incredibly expensive to do what they're doing. So they have a full call center with a bunch of people in it to take over the cars. They have road support that go out to fix the cars up.
So we were actually taking advantage of a subsidized service.
Yes. So that's very heavily. So they're losing money hand over fist. That's why Cruise got shut down. Eventually GM said.
And she did comment, and I was aware of this, that the cars are programmed to move overly conservatively.
Right.
so that they're like annoying other people at intersections, moving so slowly.
That's one of the other fundamental problems. If you think about this at scale, right, the challenge is that many cars on the road behaving in that way would make people really angry pretty quickly. I mean, San Francisco has a very sort of up and down relationship with all the technology that gets deployed there, but the fundamental reason why it's happening there and not here is that is the center of all the venture capital investment in the US.
It's always the case.
Question?
But following up on those points.
Yep.
Given the challenge that academics and research have in relating to real business and the cost involved in doing this,
Yeah.
aren't applications critical in order to try to achieve success, such as what Aurora is trying to do with commercial delivery with self-driving trucks? Long distances, cost factors, there's no density of population. How is that being contrasted, and more importantly, how is that being invested against from?
Well, we're in a very tough spot for self-driving. So,
Right.
we had this big bubble, and there was a huge pop, and the real challenge is that it just, people promised that it was going to happen on a timeline that it didn't, and for less money than it did, and then investors just sort of ran out of patience. So because of that, I mean, one of the craziest things to me is that when all the hype was happening, we were actually pretty far away, and now that nobody's paying attention, we're much closer than we've ever been in like the history of like the whole field. Investors are, they have other interests, they're fickle, and so right now it's still, even if you think about probably more economically viable businesses than robotaxis, like trucking, we're still 10 years off from that being a scale business, right? So even if you're investing in today, you're investing on a pretty long timeline, right? Like the amount of time it would take to have like the sort of returns that you would hope for, it's going to be a while. So anyways, but I fully agree, and I don't want to be seen to be anti-industry in the sense that I think that, some of the robots we built are in the context of startups. I think they're incredibly focused. They help you figure out exactly what you need your robot to do and what you need your robot not to do, because you have a lot of scarcity of resources, you really focus on a real problem. So all of that is good. I don't know how we continue to do robot projects though that cost billions of dollars and take 15 years to turn a profit. I think that we're just sort of, that is a very tough investment thesis for people to really commit to. And investors seem to get really distracted by shiny objects. So now it's all large language models, right? So like everybody that was investing in crypto 3 years ago and self-driving cars 6 years ago is now invested all in large language models. And there's, so I don't know, it's a bummer.
Here's a straight line. So what's going on in Hazelwood, Matt?
Well, Philip and I have the distinct pleasure of working on the Robotic Innovation Center, which is a new building that Carnegie Mellon is building down in Hazelwood. It is where you saw me running around chasing a robot trying to hit the emergency stop. And it is going to be 100 and some thousand square foot building that is going to house test facilities for outdoor robots, a big tank for underwater robots, a big cage for flying robots. And the real hope is that we're trying to put companies in there that want to work alongside researchers to hopefully have very application-driven opportunities and to kind of continue to foster the Pittsburgh ecosystem, particularly as it relates to startups.
And be an anchor also for neighborhood development.
And be an anchor for hopefully economic development in the neighborhood, please.
So, as a follow-up to that point about Hazelwood, how does a school like Carnegie Mellon, world-renowned reputation in AI, robotics, credible history, and fairly affluent as independent universities go, end up putting the Robotics Institute on Murray Avenue over a bagel shop?
Great question. So if you would like to continue our affluence, please send your...
There must have been some consideration, given the history, the people involved, and the resources. If the school builds out any more resources, there won't be any place for people to live in Oakland, in that vicinity. It boggles to my mind that people who come to Pittsburgh are going to be taking to Murray Avenue to go to the Robotics Institute.
Well, two things I will say that I'm really excited about for that. So we are very space constrained in Oakland, as I'm sure you can sense. And you can thank or blame me for the bagel shop above the bagel shop. That was part of one of the things that when I came in a couple of years ago was a direct effort to try to address this challenge that we faced. So we're the largest unit at CMU, Robotics Institute, biggest department. And I was like, hey, can we get some more space because we're doing all this cool work and we're bringing all this money in and great. And they said, we don't have any space for you. And I said, okay. Well, what else can we do? And they said, well, we can look off-site. And so the good and the bad thing about universities and the kind of town and gown dynamic is that like universities do buy up lots of things and that like displaces other people. But like the hope in Hazelwood and the hope here is that all of my very hungry, well-paid graduate students, as I say, taking no stance on the union, get the opportunity to go eat bagels and to do other things and to, patronize the businesses we have.
But it's gotta be tough when you're recruiting in a very competitive space,
Yeah.
the best and the brightest.
Yeah.
To come to CMU versus Stanford, MIT, et cetera.
Yes.
It's all about showcasing your presentation of what you do and the investment you make.
Agreed.
Are these people that big knuckleheads are running the school? They don't understand that in this competitive environment?
Well, you know, look,
I'm not asking you guys.
as a knucklehead who wants to keep this job, I can't comment on my bosses and their opinions. But no, what I will say is I totally think that one of the things that's been interesting about this sort of experiment, and it really is an experiment, we only took out a 3-year lease, it's going pretty well. And so the Rite Aid building to the left, if you guys know the real estate agent there, and you can figure out how to get that out of receivership and to consider if they want to lease that out as opposed to leave it empty, we'd be keen to continue to expand.
It was the old IBM space, wasn't it?
It was, but it's been, I believe Rite Aid is, it's in receivership is my understanding. But anyways, okay, sorry.
And sorry, the other thing to
Do you
add
see
is
any-
the challenge of being in a city as opposed to, say, Stanford.
Sure.
Do you see any ethical
Whatever.
considerations or a case for regulating the AI domain?
Look, it's a really interesting question. So one of the things I think as a university we're really interested in is how do we teach ethics and how do we kind of infuse that into a lot of our coursework. So we have a new, I guess it's not going to be a full degree program, it's going to be like a minor, which is going to be ethics and AI. I'm going to get the name of it wrong, but the idea is that you could then sort of dedicate a large portion of your study time to that. But we have an ethics and robotics course. There's a responsible AI center, and then a few other opportunities. And one of the things we've been thinking a lot about is how do we figure out how to train the next generation of people that are actually going to be practitioners, because as academics, we tend to build things just for knowledge sake, and so we're not actually deploying a lot of these things, so the ethical implications can be talked about, but the people who are really going to be at the coalface of this are those students that are going to graduate and go work at these large companies and really do it. And so we're trying to figure out how we fuse in an ethics, a responsible AI unit into every single course we have, so that people are getting exposure as they're learning the technical material.
And also exposing ethicists to AI.
Yes.
Do you think regulations will play a role?
So, this is a really interesting question. We've had a very laissez-faire approach towards regulating both AI and robotics to date. I don't have a really strong opinion one way or another. I can say that one of the things that we definitely shouldn't do is let companies that have a very vested interest in a thing going one way or another write the regulation. That has been a long-standing lesson that I have learned. That's probably bad. But other than that, I think I would take any proposals as to how we could propose regulation that would make sense. Yeah.
For what it's worth, I'm taking an OSHA course
Yeah.
from John Hoover on ethics and AI.
There you go. I love it.
We've been here for an hour or so talking about AI, and I haven't heard the word China.
Sure.
I just wondered what your view is on what's going on there.
It's really interesting. So I think it's a good example of a lot of the really cool and interesting stuff that sort of we were doing jointly and now we're doing sort of separately. So let's take self-driving cars. So if you rewind back to like 2014, 2015, we were really in sync, the US and China. And then you can look sort of the next couple of years after that, we started to see sort of these concerns and import sort of regulations around that. And then we started to see this divergence where a lot of the sensors that we used to get from China we couldn't get anymore and all of that. And so they've sort of gone off on their path and we've gone off on our path. Now the hope was, from a protectionist sense, that we would develop our own great sensors and we would have all this good stuff. That hasn't really materialized yet. So if you want to get the best LiDAR sensor, you got to go to China to get it, and you can't really get it now. So I don't know. It's a really interesting question. I think the lesson that I have learned is that we, at least as academics, the more we are publishing our work and talking about it, the better off we tend to be. And the more we don't do that, the more we sort of end up in this ecosystem we're in now, where it appears like Chinese AVs are going to probably eclipse where we are, at least in terms of deployment, pretty quickly. And certainly for like a lot of the hardware in robotics. So, you know, we've had pretty regular interactions with sort of committees and others that are interested in talking to us about what our opinion is. And my opinion is, like, let's make robots useful and make human lives better, and then hopefully that'll make all of our lives better. But I don't know. That's my perhaps naive 2 cents. Yeah.
There's one quick, a couple things I was thinking of, but I visited, it's not easy to visit the place on Murray Avenue.
Yes.
And I noticed one of their places, they have this thing where now you can paint like Vincent van Gogh or whoever,
Yes.
whatever artist you look at. And I think a lot of people would look at it as, you know, just kind of like a fine line between like interpreting and plagiarism.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's just another whole thing. But you said that Professor Rajvedi has said that robotics had saved, was it 100,000 or 10,000 lives? I was wondering exactly what all.
Oh, he was proposing that if you could do that, you should really focus on it. So he was talking about autonomous driving. So there's about 30,000, I don't know, I get the stat wrong. I think there's about 30,000 road deaths a year, at least there was a while back. And so the idea is that autonomous driving had the ability to perhaps reduce that significantly, and that was his pitch. Now, if your question is like, how many lives have robots saved as of today? We have very few working robots. So you got that robot vacuum cleaner that's in your house. You have some assembly robots. So yeah, so it's a really interesting question. I would say that if you look at some of the things like fully autonomous driving, if that were rolled out effectively, I do think you could see 30, 40, 50,000 lives saved a year. Yeah, pretty much sense. Any other questions? I think we're running out of time. Yes?
If you need more space, have you thought about areas like in the Homestead waterfront and surrounding area? Because right now there's a Walgreens right at the end of the Homestead Graves Bridge. It's been empty for over 6 months.
Yeah. So we right now we have Lawrenceville, Hazelwood Green, and here. So we're trying to double down on those sites at the moment. But if you ask me, like, what is the long-term vision here, I think CMU is really committed to, I think, trying to provide economic opportunities in Pittsburgh in a variety of different neighborhoods. And so I think the Hazelwood Green is going to be an experiment as to how effective we are at doing that. And are we going to be able to do that differently than we did in Lawrenceville? So Lawrenceville, doing great relative to how it was when I was here in like the early 2000s, from like a house price and like businesses perspective. Now, if you didn't own your home in Lawrenceville and you moved there in like the late 90s and you live there now, I don't know, your rent's probably a lot higher, and I don't know if you like all the coffee shops and the things that have come in. So we're trying to think about how do we not do that again. Not that that was an intentional mistake, but I think there was a lot less planning that went into our expansion in Lawrenceville than is going into Hazelwood Green. So that's my 2 cents. Any other questions? Thank you all so much. This is great.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Johnson-Roberson. We appreciate your time and insights. And also, again, thank you, Philip, for arranging for this presentation. Next month, we're going to have one of our board members, Charles Suckup, talk about some of the items in the City of Pittsburgh archives. That's Tuesday, March 11th. So appreciate it if you could be here for that. And again, I remind you to sign up for the Dragon's Den tour a week from Sunday. The registration deadline is this Friday, the 14th. We have some registration forms on the back table. So thank you for being here, and enjoy the rest of your evening.